Welcome. My name is Ira Chinoy. This is Allison Druin. We are the co-directors of the Future of Information Alliance, and we welcome you here today for what we think will be a great exploration of both the challenges and opportunities associated with crowdsourcing.
But before we dive in, we need to thank our partners. The Future of Information partners have been very supportive and instrumental in making the Future of Information Alliance what it is. In particular, the Robert W. Deutsch Foundation, which has been instrumental both in the support of our Visiting Futurists program and for our Sea Grant competition focused on students. From the Deutsch Foundation today, we have Jane Brown and Neil Dietrichson and Mac McClure, and we want to thank you and welcome you. Thank you.
So speaking of the Seed Grant program, which the Deutsch Foundation made possible, we had 9 teams of students and their faculty mentors make presentations this morning, and 4 winning teams were picked to receive stipends and expense reimbursements for the spring and to carry out wonderful projects. We'll put the names of those winners on our website, but right now I was actually wondering if there's anyone in the room who submitted a proposal, any student, any faculty member, or any member of our sort of founding partners, outside partners who are participating in these in any way, if you would just stand up. Don't be shy.
Yeah.
All right, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. We also want to thank the Smithsonian Institution for participating in this program today on crowdsourcing and who will be hosting the Futurists tonight. And we also want to thank WAMU 88.5 for hosting our Futurists tomorrow. You can listen in on the Kodra Namdi show and you'll be able to hear more from them as well.
Okay, so you're gonna get rid of us now. We're gonna turn the microphone over to Sherry Parks, who's gonna be our moderator for the day. Sherry is the Associate Dean for Research, Interdisciplinary Scholarship, and Programming in the College of Arts and Humanities, and she is also an Associate Professor in American Studies, and that's like her day job. And then she's also a cultural critic for WYPR, the NPR affiliate in Baltimore. So, Sherry, take it away.
Thank you, Ira and Ellison. I am here and happy to be here because crowdsourcing, I think, is the Janus of the internet, revealing new ways of communicating and being human, while at the same time returning us to the village, reversing the isolation of the old media, where when television hit saturation points, dinner parties dropped. And it returns us to a village based not on geography or ethnicity, but on intent and interest. Other new media have blurred the lines of work and play. Crowdsourcing erases it, showing us that people are willing to do complex tasks or tedious tasks, making us at once, I think, free-thinking complexly and organized complexly, as complex as ants or bees. And as we learn more about them, we see that we have more in common with them. So that is why I'm excited from my particular perspective. We also have a welcome today from Patrick O'Shea, who is Vice President of the university for research and other things, and he is here to welcome you. Oh, there you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, as Sherry said, I'm Patrick O'Shea. I'm the Vice President and Chief Research Officer for the university. So I'm the guy who's in charge of the creation of all new and useful knowledge on this campus. I'm the go-to guy. If you want me to, anything new, I'm it. But people always ask me, well, what's new? You know, what are you guys working on? What bio, nano, info, future-y thing are you guys working on? And I say, the answer hasn't changed in 1,000 years. We're working on what's important to people. We're developing methodologies to feed and fuel, to house, to heal our people in an advanced society that's both secure and free. And I'm confident that crowdsourcing is going to help with every single one of these things to better humanity, to do good things for society in all sorts of ways. But you know, there's nothing new under the sun. Crowdsourcing is not new. And I always like to look back at the historical perspective. You know, the first person to actually use modern communication technology for crowdsourcing for the common good was a gentleman named Joe Henry. Most of you haven't heard of Joe Henry, but he happened to be the keynote speaker at the opening day of this university in October 5th, 1859. Now, what was the new information technology in 1859? The telegraph. Where were the first telegraph experiments done? About 1.5 miles from where we are today, over by the metro station, along that railroad line. That's where Samuel Morse and several other people, working with the founder of this university, sent that message between Baltimore and Washington, what had God wrought. Now, that wasn't very practical, that was just point-to-point communication. But Joe Henry figured once there were telegraph offices all over the country in St. Louis and far west places like Chicago and New Orleans, he could gather in information from there to solve a big problem, which is figuring out what the weather was going to be. All right? He understood that the weather seemed to be always coming from that way. So if I know what the weather was in New Orleans or St. Louis yesterday, I could predict what it's going to be here tomorrow. And so Joe, basically working with telegraph operators, crowdsourced all sorts of information to invent the modern science of weather forecasting. And, you know, it comes around to today that just a few months ago, NOAA just actually moved its Climate and Forecasting Center to College Park. So we're now, again, the epicenter of the universe. But in terms of weather forecasting. But I said the guy who did this was Joe Henry. And you know, I didn't explain exactly who he was. He was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. That's what he's famous for. And of course, the greatest scientist, Joseph Henry, is the greatest scientist of the middle part of the 19th century. So we are honored to have the University of Maryland collaborating with our co-sponsor, the Smithsonian Institution, since the founding of this university. And so I'd like now to introduce the next speaker, Anne Van Camp, who is the director of the Smithsonian Archives. I'm sure she knows a lot more about Joseph Henry than I do. Please welcome Anne.
Well, thanks, Pat, for stealing my story. No, it's very important and appropriate, I think, that the Smithsonian Institution is a partner of the Future of Information Alliance, because we're an institution that's really all about the past, the present, and the future of information. We're currently totally engaged across the institution in an interdisciplinary dialogue that we hope will help address the major challenges of the present to ensure that our future includes a sustainable, viable, and healthy planet. We're proud to be a founding partner of this Future of Information Alliance and a partner in hosting this event on crowdsourcing. And as Allison mentioned earlier, we're going to be hosting the Futurists later this evening at the Smithsonian. We really look forward to that particular visit, as we believe the importance of this conversation like this with the Futurists is really very important in helping us harness the power and promise of what crowdsourcing can really help us do. So thank you again for letting us co-host this particular event, and we look forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Okay, now, first let me introduce you to the futurists that you will soon hear from. And I'm going to introduce them all at one time. First, Dan Russell, Google's, I think he has the best job title in the world, Director of User Happiness, who has been involved with the FIA since its inception, is this year's FIA Futurist in Residence. He and UMD computer science professor Ben Peterson will demonstrate uses of tools for crowdsourcing. Then our next visiting futurist will be Jennifer Chan, who is Director of Global Emergency Medicine at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine, and Associate Faculty and member of the Crisis Dynamics Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. In addition to being a practitioner of emergency medicine who has been involved in disaster relief efforts in Haiti and elsewhere, she is involved in using, evaluating, and improving crowdsourced crisis mapping tools such as Ushahidi. After this, we will have visiting futurist Sam Gregory, who is program director and leads the Cameras Everywhere initiative at Witness, a nonprofit co-founded by musician Peter Gabriel to use video and participatory technologies to expose human rights abuses, and the recent winner of a Night News Challenge. Sam helped launch the YouTube Human Rights Channel and the Obscura Cam and Informa Cam. He is an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School, was a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio resident on the future of video-based advocacy, and was named a young global leader of the World Economic Forum in 2012. And finally, we will wrap up with Craig Newmark, the founder, and as he would like me to say, customer service representative of Craigslist. But rather than talking and taking questions today about Craigslist, he is here to discuss Craig's Connects, which he launched in 2011 as a platform for extending the reach of technology and social networking for philanthropy, public service, and the public good. He is a technology advisor to more than a dozen nonprofits and government agencies and serves on the boards of directors of such organizations as the Center for Public Integrity, the Sunlight Foundation, Consumers Union Consumers Reports, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Each of our futurists will present their ideas for approximately 10 minutes. The first will be a little longer. And then we'll take a question, one question from the panel and one question from the audience. And then after our last speaker, there'll be time for lots of questions from everybody. First, take out your device, whatever you've got, your smartphone, your whatever, and turn it to the internet. And you'll understand that in a minute. So yes, you get to play with them today, unlike other situations. And now, Google's Dan Russell and our own Ben Peterson.
So today, Ben and I, actually let's switch places. Ben and I are going to do an experiment with you. This is a day of crowdsourcing, and so we thought, hey, we have a crowd, we have a problem, let's do an experiment with you. And so last week, Ben was visiting me at Google as a visiting scholar, and we sort of came up with this idea about doing knowledge elicitation from the crowd about one of the key topics of the Future of Information Alliance. And in particular, we want you to be thinking about what are the major information trends during the next year. So to that end, we've got a little piece of software that Ben's cooked up that will allow you to enter in your thoughts about the information trends during 2013. So we'd like you to first go to this URL, qa-umd.appspot.com. Okay, there are little slips, okay? Does everybody have a little slip? How many of you are on the internet right now?
More importantly, how many are not, that have a device that need internet connectivity?
Okay.
So can some helpers find little slips and hand them out to people that have their...
Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up.
You need connectivity.
Okay.
Keep your hands up and paper will get delivered to you. You need to go to the UMD network, not UMD Secure, just UMD.
Okay, so there's one more up in front. Okay, here's the master plan for the next 10 minutes. We're going to enter a first phase of getting everybody in the room to contribute their ideas. Okay, so you're going to put in what you think is the most interesting or most salient information trend you expect to see this year. Okay, we will then cluster all those together, and then we'll go into a second phase, which will allow you to add tags to each of these clusters of ideas, and thereby what we're hoping to do is to first elicit and then refine out some ideas from you about the trends of 2013.
So what I'm going to show you here, so you can, okay, the URL is always going to stay up here.
What happened?
Okay, sorry, that's what you mean by go back.
QA-UMD-appspot.com, APPSPOT.com.
And what you should see on your screen is a very simple screen with a text box with this question. Give an example of an information trend you expect to see in 2013. Do many of you see that screen? Okay, so if you see that screen,
get to work.
Get to work, enter one sentence and click the submit button. Ah, thank you. You have to log in with the Google account. Crucial.
Right. Go ahead, create one. Make my day. Yeah.
So since this is still, I'm going to just unplug this and try again.
Yeah. So while we're working out the video problems, what we're trying to do is to get a lot of ideas from people. So once you enter an idea about the technology trend, go ahead and hit submit, and then you can enter, now we're on.
All right, strange PowerPoint conflict.
And then go ahead and enter a second or a third or however many ever you want for about the next 3 minutes.
Okay, so while you're doing that, I am going to show you what you are all entering.
So it's important to know that what we're doing now is not the normal crowdsourcing model. This is a synchronous model where we're all contributing stuff in real time. So during the next couple of minutes, we're going to start, can you Command plus this? Yeah. So we can see it, there you go. So what we're seeing are some of the ideas that people are putting in. As you can see, there are a lot of you, and the results are starting to pour in. Now, this is good, because what we'll do in a second is reduce the total number of contributions by clustering them. So Ben has written a piece of code that will take all the entries you've been putting into the system and group them by some kind of topicality measure. Okay? So we'll let this go for another 2 minutes.
I'm just going to refresh this. Actually, it's interesting.
If you can't get on, find somebody near you who has a device that is working, so you can all contribute. Okay?
Amazingly slow. This is just one query.
Yeah?
Can't explain why.
Sure, go for it. So normally crowdsourcing works by having lots of people work asynchronously. Someone will put out a question, say to Mechanical Turk, which is a popular crowdsourcing mechanism, and have many, many people work on that problem or on individual problems. That can happen over a period of time, a day or two or a week. Then all the results of that are then aggregated together and someone does an analysis of all the pieces that were contributed. So the idea here is both to farm out a large complex problem into tiny pieces and let individuals work on all those pieces. Then the power of the crowd is to have all this work get done relatively quickly and then pull it all together so we can start to see collectively what the aggregate wisdom is all about. Okay, so what are we seeing here, Ben?
Well, so one of the interesting things is both to sort of see this information flow, but also to recognize an information flow is not the same as an information analysis, right? It is both kind of maybe inspiring and at the same time impossible to understand, right? And so what I'm going to do now is switch to the sort of second phase where we're going to see if we have any chance of understanding and making sense of this.
Okay, so do we want them to stop entering?
Yeah, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop you from entering more information. So with any luck, I have the ability to stop new stuff from entering. Unfortunately, it's very slow to load, and I can't quite explain this. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a little algorithm run on our servers and take these couple hundred or so ideas and automatically do some kind of textual analysis to try and group these based on the words in these ideas. And so right now, with any luck, there is a program running on a server that's analyzing this data. It's going to break this up into 10 clusters. And in just a minute, we will see these different clusters of information. And each of you on your device will be assigned one of those 10 clusters. You will then see you may now see a button that says Start Tagging, something like this. And if you click on that, but it's not, unfortunately, actually, that may have been a mistake.
This is experimental.
Yeah, this is experimental. And one of the challenges with doing things with 200 people compared to your experiments is it runs a lot slower.
Starting to load. So I'll tell you what we're trying to do is you'll each be assigned into a cluster. So maybe other people near you will be in the same cluster. It doesn't matter. Look at the items in that cluster and then start to assign tags. Now, for people who haven't tagged before, it's just a 1 or 2 or maybe even 3-word short phrase that describes sort of the essence of that set of sentences or that set of ideas that you see in your cluster. Ideally, what will happen is that these clusters will be very, very different from each other. So for example, one cluster might be about large data analysis, which is the subject of our next FIA meeting in May. Another cluster might be about, say, the use of health information. Another one might be a cluster about, say, I saw a bunch on gun control going on. What we want you to do then is to start to annotate each cluster by those tags that you think best describe that cluster.
And in the chance that the clustering is not working, what we might want to do is yield our time and then try and take 5 minutes back at the end, rather than try and figure out what's going on right now.
It might take a few more minutes to finish clustering.
Either that or something else.
Okay. Ben will debug the experimental system.
Notice I made sure Dan used the word experimental at the beginning.
This experimental system, he said repeat it multiple times. So that's, so can we do that? Dynamically reschedule?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's what we should do since this
Okay.
is in any case taking too long.
So we'll come back. Ben will have fixed everything up and we'll see the power of crowdsourcing.
Yes.
All right? Thanks.
So sorry and thank you. Which slide should I go to next?
Jennifer.
Jennifer, yeah, there you go. Okay.
And as you just heard, our next futurist is Jennifer Chan.
No, it's all good. So it's great to be here today, and I want to talk to you about disasters and humanitarian crisis. And did you know that since 1960, approximately up to the current date, there's been 6-fold increase in natural disasters? And then in 2011, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees reported that there were 42 million forcibly displaced people around the world. And as we look at that number over the past 10 years, the number of displaced people within their own sovereign states or own countries are growing. So they're not crossing country lines, but they're in their own homes, moving quickly, likely to do conflict and war. But in this type of environment, what does information look like? And what is the new digital age doing with this type of space? And what sort of information flows and potential outcomes are we seeing in this whole new space? But I put up these pictures here to remind myself, to remind us as a group, is as we talk about methodologies, crowdsourcing, microtasking, analysis, accuracy, all that good stuff, really, a lot of this is about people. And what does information mean? For Dr. Hillary Kramer up in the top, right after Katrina, coordinating the American Red Cross with ground responders. What will crowdsourcing mean to someone like her in the future? And here on the lower left, the gentleman in the picture, this is Syria. What does information mean to him? Will it be crowdsourcing? Will it be something very different? Will it be him getting his family to a safe place? Will it be him using Twitter to do something that he believes he needs to do for his country? And lastly, what about the refugee camps that we have in the world? Some of them are the largest ones that I'll talk about. And what does information mean to people who are in the most vulnerable positions? Sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. What does information mean to them? But there's amazing things that have been happening over the years, and I want to show you a brief video of what happened after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011. And this comes from YouTube, and it shows the flow of Twitter soon after the event. And you'll see that information comes out of Japan right after the disaster. It flows across the world. And you'll see information flowing in different directions. And you'll see the global replies coming back in blue. And then you'll see the color green come across. And these are retweets. And this is really amazing about the ability for people to communicate during times of disasters. But the question still remains, is that 5 months later, in Dadaab, 500,000 people registered as of a couple of days ago. We are still finding that there are information gaps, despite all this amazing information movement that we're seeing in other types of modalities. In the assessment done by Internews, there were 70% of new refugees said that they lacked information. Information of where to find food, water, shelter, medicine, and also lacked information how to communicate with their families and communities in this time of protracted, prolonged crises. So what happens is that we have information that can move very quickly, can be analyzed very quickly, but at the other end of the spectrum, we have information in very vulnerable communities sometimes, where it's fragmented and there's significant information gaps. And what happens for some communities is that they are left in the dark. Despite a lot of flow of movement, they still are not necessarily in the know of what they need for themselves to make a better life in the setting of crises. But within these two spectrums that I'm talking about, there lies something that's growing in the middle, and that's crowdsourcing and microtasking during times of disasters and crisis. But before I move on to that, I want to briefly say that in this assessment, we found out, or Internews found out, that radio is actually a very low-tech, durable communication modality, something to think about and remember, something to mesh with high technology in the future. And we also found out that 10% of refugees access the internet in Kenya, where telco is very strong and wide, and it only costs some people 2 shillings a minute to be able to use that. There are opportunities in the future for communities like these for which they can transfer information. But I want to talk to you about Mission 4636, because I believe it's a really interesting and powerful example of crowdsourcing and microtasking during disasters. And this happened after the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Groups of people came together, decided to put together a short code, 4636, and with that communicated to the Haitian-affected communities after the earthquake and said, if you want to share information, potentially tell us your needs, tell us what's going on, and we can try to share them, you can freely use this short code. And all information from the community started flowing in. But what's interesting to note is that online, a whole group of people around the world started microtasking and crowdsourcing this information. But actually who these people are, 95% of them were part of the Haitian community. Haitian nationals, later on when they were able to get online again, the Haitian diaspora in the beginning, processing lots and lots of messages. This is an example of one message. So online, people were taking it from Haitian Creole, translating it into English, categorizing it, and geocoding it. So you'll see there's unstructured information, categorized, name, location, need, request. But over the first 6 weeks and then all the way up to the following 16 months, there were more and more and more pieces of information. This brings up a very important question that many of us are trying to address. In this new digital age with microtasking and crowdsourcing, what do you do with information explosion? How do you filter? How do you validate? Who tells you what's validated or not? How do you prioritize? I may prioritize something different than you do, different to somebody who I may have never met before. Governments, NGOs, UN agencies, and sometimes most importantly, local communities themselves. The question becomes, Should it be humans, microtasking and crowdsourcing? What's the role of computers? Should they be separate, different projects, different spaces, or should they mesh together so that we can maximize a complementary approach? But in the end, a report came out from Rob Monroe, who was one of the key members of how this whole project came about. And he published in 2012 talking about what happened with some of this information. And a lot of this was related to distributed networks. The Haitian community, actually, as they were translating and microtasking, they themselves became digital first responders. They called their families, they communicated messages to other communities through their own local and personal networks. And that was a very powerful way to respond during a crisis. So these are new communities, information flows, opportunities, and challenges. But I want to quickly take us local to talk about Superstorm Sandy and another example. So soon after Superstorm Sandy, there was a large crowdsourcing effort that was part of a relationship between FEMA, the Civil Air Patrol, planes that fly over disaster affected and take pictures, and the crowd. Basically brought together by a couple of key individuals from Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, John Crowley and Skylar Earle. So what happened within the first 48 hours is they launched the platform, and 6,000 people came online and took a look at this imagery and decided if it was light, medium, or heavy damage from the pictures that they saw. It wasn't a deep experiment. It was not a randomized control trial. There were no crossover studies or cohorts, but it was something for the purposes of helping FEMA make decisions. So what did we see? 137,000 assessments within the first week, 35,000 aerial images that were processed, and 6,000 digital volunteers. 50% of this was processed in the first 24 to 48 hours. So a couple of us came together and says, we need to start analyzing now in real time. We're not going to wait for all the data to get pretty in the end. We're going to do this now. And as they crowdsourced, we analyzed at the same time. Rob Monroe, myself, Skylar, John Crowley in the field. And we found out that it took volunteers 15 seconds to make an assessment. And over 50% of the images had almost a 100% agreement between two viewers. And I leave an anecdote on the bottom because I think this is about where I'd like to see research and activities go in the future, is what are the outcomes on decision makers? Has it made an impact? How do we know and take anecdotes that are very powerful, that we hear from responders and communities, and how do we get a better, broader understanding of what it means to have these crowdsourcing and microtasking activities? So I'm going to skip forward over one example about Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. But I'll give you a personal anecdotal example. This was a crowdsourced effort after Haiti that created a real-time map. And as time went through the weeks, you could see the granularity of a map. And I was actually a deputy of operations in a field hospital. And as a first responder myself, a physician, a public health responder, and a humanitarian, I use these maps every day because it meant something to me in the actions that I did on a daily basis. We need to know how many more people like me or not like me found this useful or not. But as we go forward, there are challenges. Accessibility, knowledge, and trust. How do we know that crowdsourcing, with all the major hours and passions that people and volunteers have, how do we know that traditional organizations or communities themselves will trust this information so that they'll use it? What are the issues around security, information, and privacy? I may provide information, but it may not be secure. And will there be risks? Will there be retaliatory events? And what other both computer, technical, and human interventions or understandings should we put together to better understand what this means in the broader picture? The methods of analysis are broad, and they are so exciting. There's natural language processing, participatory methods, and so many probably more new methodologies that we, I hope, will all bring together our multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to create something that will fit the needs of what we're looking to do. But I do want to go and talk a little bit about what happens in that last mile. What happens in the field? What happens within communities? And what is the impact on situational awareness, decision-making, action, and response? Because this is sometimes what the field looks like, or what communities look like. You'll see in the lower left, and this is actually at one of the field hospitals I worked at in Haiti, we had a satellite. We had multiple different computers. Probably a majority of every single clinical provider had a mobile phone. But what you're seeing right here is a patient tracking system. So in a very technology resource, relatively rich environment post-disaster, why are key providers still going offline? There needs to be an exploration and researchers and policymakers, we need to understand why this happens, because this happens frequently around the world. And there's great opportunities to figure out, not necessarily to transition it solely to technology-based, but to understand where we can potentially mesh it together. And also, this may be the reality in the field with regard to if you depend on information inflows. It may be a cell phone that needs to be connected to a wood board that's connected to a generator. So how will that affect your information inflows? How will it affect your crowdsourcing and microtasking? What will be the time delays or compensations that you take from another side that will get you to the end? And so I'll be very brief. This is a diagram by a colleague, Carlos Castillo, and looks at the interface between what emergency responders need, computers can do today, and specifically looking at tweets. I want us to focus on A, on the area where all these realms can come together so we can expand that area of understanding. I'm going to move and want to propose to you all a little bit of a broader perspective. What do decision makers during disasters need? Governments, communities, tribal leaders, people like you and me if we're in the field. What is humanitarian technology? That includes Twitter, Facebook, crowdsourcing, microtasking. But I want to change that third circle. And instead of computers, I want to talk about researchers, students, and academicians. Because perhaps you're in computer science and you use computers, and that'll be part of your interface. But what if you were a journalist, an anthropologist, a design specialist, a physician? How can we all come together and make that specific area of A larger? Because there are common goals with regard to what we want to help support during times of disaster. And I just ask you today, will you be part of this change?
Thank you.
I do.
Is there one question from?
I do. Actually, I really like this analysis at the end of the intersection of all this, because one of the things that happens in crises and disasters of various forms is that the communication systems are often compromised. So, for example, in Egypt, the country was basically lost the internet during part of that. And so some Google engineers hooked up a voice-to-tweet service. So you could call a magic phone number, kind of like the number you gave, and it would be turned into a tweet, which then restored that sort of mechanism. My question to you is, are there analogous things that you're thinking about, or what's the best way to sort of reinvigorate a compromised communication system? Or how are you thinking about that?
So one of the areas that I think will help come to a better understanding of what this will look like and how to transfer information from tech limited to offline back to online is simulation, actually. There are a lot of disasters that are cyclical, that are frequent and common, and that's both natural and complex. And if we can begin to invest in understanding what communities do during these times and speak with them, and then be able to simulate with them, the idea around voice to Twitter, but perhaps in another context, it's no way. Voice to mobile, or voice to tribal leader, and then tribal leader to some organization that can get online or can get into a technology communication pathway. But there's so much rich information that we have with communities and people who are working in the region that I think that will, and then that plus simulation, I think will really open up those doors.
Yeah. And Sam's going to come up while we fill one question from the audience. Is there? Okay, well, we will move on then, and you'll save your questions till the end. Okay. And as soon as it comes up, this is Sam Gregory.
While we're getting the slides up, let me also thank the organizers here, the Future of Information Alliance and Smithsonian, University of Maryland, and particularly also the Deutsche Foundation, who've also been very kind supporters of Witness. So thank you all. I'd like to start actually by talking a little bit from my own personal experience as a human rights activist. Last autumn, I was lucky enough to be at the Capitol when Aung San Suu Kyi came to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. I've been an activist on Burma for 20 years, and I had a moment where I got to shake her hand. And of course, the thing I did straight away was take a photo and upload it to Instagram. And it set me thinking about the nature of media and media generation around human rights. Because I thought back to 1988 and 1990 when I first got involved, and there was so little imagery from Burma. There was one clip that year after year people would reach out to me and say, do you have that footage? How do I get hold of that clip? And then I thought about 2007, when the monks went on the street in the Saffron Revolution, these tremendous images, and there were a few courageous people in Burma who documented then with handheld cameras, but mobile phones cost $1,000 to get a SIM card, so very few people had them. And then about 4 months ago, I guess, I was in Burma. Amazingly, I was in the country where for 20 years I'd been campaigning from outside, and I was standing outside Aung San Suu Kyi's house when President Obama came to visit. Tremendous crowd, amazing energy, and everyone had a mobile phone, and they were filming this same moment. And then I thought about what was going on in the north of the country. And I knew there were places where there was ethnic cleansing going on, there were violent attacks going on ethnic minorities, and there were very few images. And this really kind of captured for me this tension that is at the heart of Witness's work, which goes back right to when we were started at the Rodney King incident, when it was this idea of how do you think about the potential of the citizen witness? The person like George Holliday, who filmed the original Rodney King incident and then turned that into a news sensation. This was the beating of an African-American man in Los Angeles, and a court case. And Witness came out of that moment thinking, what if instead of the accidental witness, it was the purposeful witness who was documenting these things? So let's fast forward 20 years, and we are in what we often think of as this cameras everywhere moment. And I want to be careful about that word. Let's be clear. Probably most people in this room have a camera. There are many places where there aren't. But the movement is tremendous. And it's a movement that is about cameras, but it's linked to mobile devices, and it's linked to the internet. And the media that people are creating is huge. The volume is incredible. This was an interesting statistic from last year that I pick up on a lot, because when we think about human rights video, we often think about Coney. But the vast majority of that citizen witnessing is coming out of those 72 hours. It's the person in Syria, in East Timor, in Central African Republic, and there are huge amounts of it. There were 350,000 hours of video uploaded from Syria last year. Just think about that. Video that shows a lot of the atrocities that are going on there. And this is uploaded by a huge diversity of people. This clip kind of captures some of the people who I see in that universe. It's everyone from the people who are in Tahrir Square or in the Occupy movement. It's citizen activists working in places like Mexico and Kenya. It is the people who curate that video. And I often think of curators as a really key part of this, and they're, in some senses, the crowdsourcers, the people who look at the volume of video and make sense of it. And it's also the people who you don't expect. So a lot of the video that I encounter as a human rights activist is, in fact, perpetrator-shot video. It's the video, in this example, of the policeman in Egypt who was beating someone and filmed it for his own entertainment. So I want to focus on one aspect of this vast diversity of people. I want to think about how we harness the witnessing capacity of the crowd. So I'm not going to talk in this talk about some other ways we could think about crowdsourcing. I'm not going to talk about how we harness the potential of the crowd to solve the problem, or to craft the solutions or identify the solutions. I'm going to say, how do we tap into this vast volume of people who are ready to be the first-person witness? The first-person witness to the atrocity in the street in Syria, or the act of police brutality in New York. And there are three questions that we really grapple with in human rights work about how do we do this. And this really relates back to what Jennifer was talking about as well. How do we enable people to do this impactfully, safely, and ethically? How do we do that in a way when it's not just about the places where there can be lots of witnesses, but also the places where there aren't many, and where there's not something that's so easily documentable? So beating someone in the street is documentable. A hurricane is documentable. A lack of access to education is not like that. It's a far more difficult topic to grapple with. And then a third question, which comes up in my world, and it's about images, but it applies to any form of information. And I think it's particularly dangerous in the case of images. How do we turn this volume of images into something that provides motivation to action, rather than this decontextualized kind of sense of compassion fatigue? And I bet any of you who've watched a video from Syria probably felt afterwards, what on earth do I do now? Now imagine if you're trying to watch 200,000 of those or sift through 200,000 of those. And this Auden quote often really brings it back for me. The issue that most of the time, people don't want to pay attention to this. They don't want to react to it. They want to be able to turn away. Every act of human rights violation occurs against the backdrop of the rest of us getting on with our lives. So I want to talk about 5 challenges and opportunities that I think we need to address in order to support citizen witnesses and make them part of this tremendous pool of capacity in a meaningful way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, but also about what other people are doing. So the first area is the issue of trust and authentication. There is so much of this volume of video, but people look at the material from Syria and say, how do I know that is true? How do I know that wasn't falsified? How do I know that's true evidence that could be used in a court, used in news, or be used to warn the next community along that they are at risk? So if you look at this image, do we know this is a phosphorus bomb in Syria? Should this be war crimes evidence? Or was this all photoshopped together? Or was this an execution in Sri Lanka? Was this an extrajudicial execution where the military took 6 unarmed civilians or prisoners of war and executed them? Or has it been staged? Can we use this as a way to prove a crime or to generate international attention? This is an issue that many people are grappling with. I was recently at the International Criminal Court, and they're looking at the case of Libya from last year. And most of the evidence they'll have to deal with there is material that was uploaded by those citizen witnesses to places like YouTube and Facebook. So they're grappling with this in court settings. And what this means is often they're trying to go through 4 key elements that are critical to understanding whether something is valid. These are very simple, and actually they're pretty common to the news journalism world as well, which is, who shot it? Where did they shoot it? Who else can tell us whether this is true? And what's been the chain of custody in legal terms? But we might also just put that very simply, who's tampered with it? Who might have got hold of it? And there are a number of ways people are grappling with this, and we've already touched on in Jennifer's presentation, the range from the human to algorithmic. I actually think some of them are very basic. We spend a lot of our time training people to think about how they validate in the frame. So if you're a citizen witness, this is a tremendously courageous man called Ahmed Biassi in Syria, who in a video held up his identity card and said, I can prove that I was the man who was abused in this square. Now that puts him at tremendous risk. There are other solutions in the world I operate in that are about the intersection of that bravery of an individual and the power of looking, for example, at the Google Maps that show whether a particular location looks like that at that time of year, listening to the accents. I've put up the example here of a group called Storiful we collaborate with, who do that. So they take a piece of citizen evidence, they look at it, they say, are there the signs of authentication in the frame? Can we look at a Google map and see if it looks like that? And can we also look at the social media ecosystem around it that tells us whether other people tweeted that, whether the person who shared it first is reliable? Have they shared many reliable pieces of information over time? And we've also been thinking about how you think about this technologically. One of the projects we work on at Witness is a tool called InformaCam, which is a way of when you take an image or a video of embedding all the types of data that are gathered on a mobile device, the GPS, the latitude, the direction you're moving in, and securely encrypting them into the file in a way that can show this is what that image looked like at that moment, and this is all the data that can help you address those who, what, when, where, why questions. And to do that, of course, you have to think about safety. So when you share a file like this, you have to think about who you share it to and who can decrypt it. An element of that as well that we're working on, and I've put a mock-up here, this is not a camera that exists, is thinking how do you make this mainstream? Because most people don't download apps before they go into a human rights violation. They witness it, or they're using their devices. We've been thinking a lot about how spaces like YouTube or phones build in what might be considered an eyewitness mode into the way they function, because then it's accessible to the 800 million people who use YouTube or Facebook, not just the people who've downloaded an app. Related to this, and as I say, you've also got to think about privacy, safety, and consent. So this is an image from Iran after the Green Revolution, when the Iranian government crowdsourced the identification of protesters who had taken part in the Green Revolution in 2009. This is sinister, and it's sinister because they put it publicly, but of course governments look through and sort through data, looking for people who speak out. So we think a lot about that flip side of what it means to become part of this citizen witnessing ecology. It means putting yourself at risk, often without knowing what tools are available to protect you. Now, we work in video, so a lot of our focus is around how you think about tools that anonymize people in images. And that's both the people in the protest, but it's also the lone woman in a country like Zimbabwe who speaks out about sexual violence during the elections. And in fact, she's far more vulnerable than the people in a protest, because she's the one person who stood up and said, I want to make sure this becomes a data point, becomes the way in which you secure justice here. One way we've been addressing that is thinking about how you develop tools like ObscuraCam. This is exactly the opposite of the InformaCam tool. It strips out most of the data in an image and blurs out faces. And as I said, I think it's important we think about where these become mainstream. So we were part of an effort to advocate to YouTube to build in a tool like that into their platform. Because ObscuraCam is being used by 100,000 people, this tool on YouTube can be used by 1 billion people. So that when you pick up your tool and you're in this crisis setting and you're thinking, how do I become a citizen witness, you have the tools available to you to address the core problem sets that you may be grappling with. And as I say, the importance of engaging with the tech companies here when you're thinking in the kind of citizen witness mode is key. These are some of the slides actually from the Arab Spring where people put up these sometimes slightly ironic references to, thank you Twitter and thank you Facebook. But at the same time, these are so critical. If you want to crowdsource, if you want to surface these first-hand witness accounts, you have to be there. I'm actually going to move to an end on an issue that we're still grappling with, and it's the same question of how we translate that information into action. And I will not mince my words around this. There is a question of whether we have a supply side that doesn't meet the demand side, if we're to be brutally honest in the kind of economics of this. We're trying something out here. We have a project with YouTube on the Human Rights Channel where we validate and verify human rights footage, and we contextualize it as human rights. So instead of it just being another man beaten in the street somewhere, this is evidence of a war crime. So how do you translate this? How do you surface the material that is in a space like YouTube, which is, in some sense, a giant pool of potential citizen witnesses? This is a playlist from Syria. And the final opportunity, and I think this goes to how we think about education and training, is how do you get the skills to people, how do you get them to people more rapidly, and to a broader range of people to be citizen witnesses? And I often think here in terms of a basic witnessing literacy. I actually think we should be teaching a witnessing literacy that is part of being a citizen. And what I mean by that is just as in the same way that you learn about your ABCs, I want to think about what is the Dr. Seuss ABC of witnessing something. That might be witnessing a human rights violation, it might be witnessing a news event, it might be witnessing a fender bender. How do we enable people now that we have this capacity to be part of that ecosystem of media to do that well? So let me end on that point. I think these are the spaces we need to address and look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a question from the panel?
I have one for you. Well, as you know, GPS was originally military technology that was then demilitarized and arguably changed the nature of all of our work, basically, both disaster relief and in humanitarian support and so on. At the same time, we're seeing things happening in imaging capture space. So, for example, the recent revelation that there is drones that you can fly 3 miles up with 1.2 gigapixels that allow you to identify people on the ground. And so the technology for having continuous city or continuous country, very high-res imagery 24/7 is possible. How do you, in your work, think about capabilities like that coming online?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of dynamic between what you might think of as eyes in the sky and eyes on the ground. I think there is a powerful balance between them, which is about what works for different things. So actually, I think eyes on the ground work about personal testimony, sharing experience in a way that kind of sort of look from above doesn't. So that's like an affect approach. I also think it's probably worth recognizing at the moment the imbalance of power is biased towards the state in terms of using those high, using aerial surveillance, using satellites. And so we focus very much on how do you think about the sort of the tool in the pocket and the accessibility, and in some sense the volume of ways in which individual citizens can do it versus the sort of the totalizing look from the top. But I think the two can match together, and I think there have been some interesting projects to try and start doing that.
And I think one of the interesting things is that as we project the future forward, that asymmetry grows less and less, right? I mean, there's a very active do-it-yourself drone movement right now. Sure. And there are, I don't know how many drones there are flying around right now that are owned by citizens for exactly that purpose.
Yeah, the Drones for Human Rights movement is, emerging.
Good.
Is there a question from the floor while Craig comes up?
And we'll take it. Here we go.
Come on, I can
You get extra credit for asking a question. Here you go.
There are some very bad historical precedences about citizen witnessing. I'm thinking in terms of Russia in the 50s, Stasi, religious police in various countries. How do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. I think one of I'd end up at where I ended at the last point there, which is how do we think about witnessing literacies that are positive, that are about the power of surveillance directed towards perpetrators and towards the government or the state, so potential repressors. I think it's a key part of it. I'm not going to jump to the conclusion that citizen witnessing leads to that direction. I think it's very much about how we educate people and think how they can learn and approach it.
People aren't like that.
I would disagree, actually. I think that most of the people who are witnessing in the context of Syria are doing it because they see injustice. The vast majority of the people who I work with around the world are thinking in those terms. Do I think there is a possibility, particularly if the citizen witnessing is controlled by the state? So if the state mandates something, I think there's a very different structure. If there's coercion by the state to be involved in a process of witnessing towards others, absolutely. That's not the power of people, that's the power of the state coercing individuals to be part of the state apparatus. So I think I would distinguish between being co-opted into a state apparatus and the power of individuals to hold the state and others accountable.
To be continued.
Looking from the bottom up, identifying not from the point of people in charge, but from the people who may need a break now and then. Although to be very frank, I haven't done any customer service for maybe an hour now. I'm also a nerd, meaning often that I'm kind of impatient. I'm often focused on what can be done in the here and now. I also dislike being told what I already know, and the reality is that everyone here, especially consider the age ranges I see, people here already know a lot about the everyday aspects of crowdsourcing. A lot of it has to do with using Facebook or Twitter or whatever, just sometimes to give the other person a break. Because as far as I'm concerned, crowdsourcing is about using technology to give the other person a break. Sometimes, though, you use this crowdsourcing technology in large numbers to try to make things better for everyone. I've also looked at the history of what this crowdsourcing stuff is about, and I took a look about its use in the past. A bunch of people were centered around a guy named Paul of Tarsus. These were early Christians. They built themselves some crowdsourcing technology, which they called a network of churches, and they got this guy Paul, later St. Paul, and they decided that he would write what he called epistles. We would now call them blogs, and that worked out pretty well. Later on, a guy picked up that gauntlet, so to speak, named Martin Luther. He had his own ideas about the way Christianity should take, and he made use of crowdsourcing technology using the same church store and forward network. The difference there is that he made use of what one of my colleague nerds invented, the printing press. The mistake, of course, that Gutenberg made is that he did a great job with the technology. He had a great job done with the manufacturing, but like a lot of my colleagues in Silicon Valley failed to do, he screwed up financing and then got screwed in turn by his venture capitalists. Later on, people made use of crowdsourcing to affect large-scale social change regarding the British Glorious Revolution. Later, bloggers like Thomas Paine and Ben Franklin got this American Revolution going, and more recently, people in France made use of crowdsourcing technology to create something called Les Mis. And by the way, I'd have no personality if it weren't for comedy. But now we have the present day, and now we do see people using crowdsourcing for everyday practical means, sometimes at the small scale to give people a break, maybe to create jobs, sometimes in larger scale. You look at Kickstarter, you look at Indiegogo, and you see ordinary people getting together with ordinary people to get the funding they need to build something new and innovative. As a nerd, I've fallen prey to some of the gadgetry involved. I'm wearing one watch that I got through Kickstarter. The downside is that in a month or so, I'll have 2 more. And I think I've stopped at this point, but I may need help stopping me. In larger ways, too, people have used crowdsourcing to fund political movements. That's happened on all sides of the spectrum. The Obama campaign was the pioneer of that, unless you want to give even more credit, 4 years earlier to the Howard Dean campaign. People are using crowdsourcing in the here and now, and to give people a break, and also, though, to work on a much larger stage, and that does manage to happen. My focus with this Craig Connects thing is primarily in the here and now, leading to what could be bigger things. In this country, we have something called Kiva.org. Its focus is microfinance. That's invented overseas, but the thing is that a lot of ordinary people can contribute in small amounts to help people out, to give people a break, just to get a business going out of the back of their house. They only may need a few $100s or $1,000 or $10,000, which in the U.S. is not a lot of money to start a business with. But if you're in the West Bank, $1,000 will get your business going. So Kiva is a good way to do things. In this country, there's something called DonorsChoose.org. A lot of teachers in this country, well, they're in low-income schools, and they have to often fund projects out of their own pockets. Sometimes those projects are get enough pens and paper to last the year. That's a good way where ordinary people like us, could just throw a few dollars into a teacher, making their jobs, their lives a lot easier, helping out a lot of kids. And throughout the world, I figure everyone should get to participate in this thing. So, well, there's this think locally, act globally thing. If you want to give people a voice, then get them on the net. In San Francisco, where I live, and love too, I guess, there's something called the Women's Building, which needed a hand getting a lot of people online. There's the Tenderloin Tech Center, and the Tenderloin is kind of our version of Skid Row. But there's also the Veterans Success Center and the Student Vets Lounge at CCSF. Other ways you can help people out. Think globally? Well, there's a group called Invenio in San Francisco, which focuses on how do you get serious bandwidth to places which don't have it. So we're working with them in Haiti, working with them in a couple places in Kenya, maybe Uganda, India, and working with them by trying to wire up all of the vocational schools in the West Bank. The deal is, if you want to get people involved in crowdsourcing, that means getting them a voice, and the only way I know how to do that is to get them online. This stuff is a lot of what this Craig Connects stuff is about. The idea is that I figure I can stand up and work in the here and now to get actual real stuff done in the here and now and to go beyond that stuff. First, I do want to ask people here, well, sometimes you have discretionary income and sometimes you don't have discretionary income. If you do, you can get involved in groups like Kiva or Donors Choose. I haven't announced it yet, but I'm working rapidly as of today, and I mean today, to working an effort where people can work together to help fund the low-income schools which primarily serve military families. That ain't bad. There's other stuff going on. I may be also working on a campaign with a group called CrowdRise, the focus of which will be to support those groups which support veterans, and in particular, wounded warriors and their families. These are small things that we can actually go ahead and do together. Again, these are things that you can do in the here and now. Hidden objective. Well, I heard this quote. This guy said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This is something said by the other Martin Luther guy. What he's saying is that things do get better if we work together on this. Now, I'm no community organizer. I'm a nerd, so I realize, hey, that would mean working with people, like face to face. By the way, that was a joke. But what I can do is online get people to work together more and more. I'm still figuring out how I do that. This Craig Connect stuff with the here and now kind of stuff, the hidden agenda is to figure out over a long-term period, how do we get people to work together in large numbers to have what the philanthropists call social impact? What that basically means is, how do you get people together to work together in large numbers, like St. Paul did, like Luther did, like Thomas Paine did? How do you make this happen in very large numbers to get real stuff done? So I am trying. I don't know what I'm doing, but I've started on a 20-year program, and I speak literally. I'm started on a 20-year program to go boldly where no nerd has gone before. Thanks, folks. I'd like to accept primarily questions articulated in the form of a joke.
Well, is the panel ready with a joke question or a regular question?
I don't know if it's a joke question.
Okay.
But since you've been working in sort of this area for a while now, what do you see as the future of the microfinance sort of area? Is there a market of such things? Because I can imagine with you start naming Kiva and you start going down a list, there's a dozen or 20 now. Will there be 500 in 5 years? Or how do you see this kind of market going in terms of things like Craig Connect?
Microfinance and how well it's working. Throughout the world, I don't have a clue. I talk to the Kiva folks in general, and they say they're getting a much higher rate of return than US banks have gotten in the last 15 years. And now and then I get a notice saying that somebody that I had given a loan out to has paid their loan off. That ain't bad. So I'm acting to some large extent on faith. I know that I'm getting some results. So I know that this little bit of money that I'm putting in is working. And that's it. Sometimes you do have to work on faith. And the best I can tell you then is that a nerd's got to do what a nerd's got to do.
Is there a question from the floor?
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Learning how. Learning how.
Learning how.
Learning how, okay. I have some hearing loss. Learning how. Who?
How are you learning from these mistakes, and how are you going to share them with the rest of us? Because you're doing a lot of important things on the edges, and other people need to know.
What I'm doing is working with other people to try to figure out how to work together. When I have a success, I tell people about it. It's on my blog on Craig Connects. I put it on a Huffington Post, sometimes other places like The Hill and so on. I don't have the right megaphone that I need to get all this out. Part of it has to do with the problem of herding pigeons, getting different nonprofits and so on to work together to amplify their message together. Haven't learned how to, because this involves the skills of public relations, communication, social media, and pretty seriously, I'm a nerd. Those skills are the opposite of what I'm about. What I need to be is more Don Draper and less Mr. Spock. By the way, of course, Captain Picard, Captain Kirk, you know my answer for that.
Thank you for now.
Good.
And Ben is going to come back up. And while he is doing that, all of us, and certainly all of the panelists, have implied empathy, which is a very slippery thing when you're talking about human beings. And it is that missing connection between the witnessing and the doing, and something that human beings seem to do. I think all of the panelists are talking about empathy, and while Ben is talking, I'd like for you to reflect on how it feels to feel together, because that seems to be what the research is saying about crowdsourcing and empathy, is that knowing that other people are feeling while you're feeling seems to be what propels people to do something.
Well, that is a great introduction, because what I would like you to do is to reflect on how it feels to build something, stand up in front of 200 people, and have it utterly fail. And if you think about that really hard, you'll get some sense of how I feel. So I guess there's a few interesting things here. Why don't we start with what we do have, which is we can look at your ideas. We cannot do the second part of the exercise, which is to annotate and try and collectively make sense of it, and we'll reflect on that in a second. What we do have here is the 371 ideas that you have all shared with us, and a tag cloud on the right that shows just a very simple representation of that information just by frequency of words. And so why don't we start with the tag cloud and see if that tells us anything. More Twitter, massive genomes. Of course, these words don't really go together. There's no Wi-Fi guns. And I'm not sure if personalized information is actually meant to mean anything. Regulation of free will, I kind of like that one. And if we just very quickly look through here, we'll see what you all typed in. I'll make the ideas on the left a little bit larger. World peace, gun regulation, more catfish. Some of the ones that stand out: move of youth away from Facebook. Does that mean back to MySpace or onto something else? Driverless cars will let me do more pointless Google searches. I think Dan probably can respond to that. Right, so you've already given us some room for some food for thought, which I think is going to be kind of interesting. Data visualization, more WikiLeaks, more on driverless cars, holograms, citywide Wi-Fi, that was in the news this morning. NFC, transparency, more Reddit, children's information use, more on Wi-Fi, MOOCs, right? And if you look at the little scroll bar on the right, we're about a quarter of the way through, so I'm not going to go through all of these. So there are a couple interesting lessons here. First of all, there's this incredible diversity of views of all of you, and of course what I was hoping to get to is to try and make sense of this, and I'm going to have to do this offline, which of course breaks the whole point. Because the research question here was, can we collectively do something and really learn something from 200 people in the same setting simultaneously? And it's a hard problem, and the answer today is no. By midnight tonight, probably the answer will be yes, but unfortunately we won't all be here for that. And so even though I'm not happy, I'm okay with this, because this is a research project, right? You're all, unfortunately, guinea pigs in this, and this is the nature of research, and certainly technology innovation, which is we have to be willing to try things. Dan and I had this idea last Monday, and we said, hey, let's try this crazy idea. We said, no, that's impossible. We'll try it anyway. Okay, well, it was impossible. But I think we've all learned a little bit about how this, well, what we're thinking about how this possibly could work. And maybe if I can get into a FIA email in the future, I'll be able to at least email you a little bit of analysis of this.
So I want to reflect slightly on this as well, because one of the things to know about crowdsourcing is whenever you send out a problem like this out to the crowd, one of the things I have found in my practice is that you never get it right the first time. You always have to iterate. So the fact that we got all this stuff in and we got this beautiful word cloud here is at least a 50% success. So congratulations, Ben. I mean, the other thing about that is these things often do take multiple iterations. And even the first pass, though, can often give you a lot of insight. What I want to do is get actually the CSV file from this and actually dig into it a little bit more myself. I'd be fascinated to do that. But I think it's great. So thanks for doing it.
Thanks.
Okay, now, question, answer from anybody who wants to ask the question right here.
So I have a question from the internet. So this is from a park ranger. I'm from the National Park Service. This is a park ranger back watching this live online, so hello. Hi, John. This is from John Rudy. And he asks, we're all looking at the future of the future, very motivated by activism. Is there a future for the past? How do you motivate crowdsourcing when lives aren't on the line, but only the memory of dead people?
Only the memory of
dead people, of history.
Did he ask you to ask anyone in specific, or okay, okay?
Well, oddly enough, we were just talking about this at lunch. So one of the great things about crowdsourcing is that, as you from this word cloud here, is you get a bunch of diversity. And one of the brilliant things about the changing social dynamics of the internet in the past few years has been to realize that there are people out there who have expertise about any random topic, including ones you've never heard of or thought of. That's the sort of the moral of Wikipedia for me. So one of the nice things is the possibility of taking things like from archival stuff, say from the Smithsonian, and allowing people to look at it and annotate that and start to break what is an intractable problem up into small problems that are tractable, and getting the diversity of all the people in the world to look at that and contribute what they. So we've seen examples where people are able to label things that were previously just unknowable. All of a sudden, it turns out it's somebody's sister in Dayton, right? And it turns out you can actually collectively get all that information and make things like archival imagery much more accessible, much more available.
I think there's absolutely a future in looking back toward the past, because there's so much about stories and knowledge and sharing that either within your own community across generations or to people around the world if you decide to share, who want to learn about your culture, your ideas. And from if you were to take an angle from the disaster crisis context, there is so much about history that we often should look back to so that we move to the future and to understand what we can do to potentially prevent certain types of disasters or better mitigate them as they happen or to better manage them as we go forward.
I think, I'm going to bring it back to the atrocities, but actually I think there's a reason to do that, which is, there's a question about archives, which comes up in human rights video footage, because a lot of this material is having no impact now. But in 7 years' time, in 10 years' time, it may be the way in which you prosecute someone for a war crime, and you don't know now what you're going to use as evidence then. You're not going to know that I needed to see what happened in that moment. I needed to make sure there was a witness on that corner 10 years ago. And the biggest issue, and I have colleagues who grapple with it at Witness, is that the archive is not really present. People think it's there because they're uploading it to YouTube or they're sharing it on Facebook. And that archive for that future crowdsourcing moment to find the evidentiary incident or the thing that proves it may not be there. So I actually think there's a whole cut across here that is about digital archiving that maybe the most extreme case is the war crime, but it cuts across a whole set there. And so I actually think thinking about the future so that you can understand how we'll use this material that may feel very current now, but its real use is 10, 15 years down the road, it's really important actually.
Focusing on the real and the here and now, crowdsourcing is already being used for this purpose. As a terribly boring individual but interested in history, I can recommend a number of podcasts starting with the history of Rome, then going to the history of Byzantium, which was actually just the Eastern Roman Empire. It's like, go Byzantines. And then there's the history of England, the history of the English language, and a few more beyond that. And the deal is that these guys are just reading books, but then getting help from a lot of friends, building fairly palatable stories of history. They're doing it generally for free, for the love of what they're doing. I hereby declare them nerds. And it's great because this has been for me a painless way to learn a lot more history. And I apologize last night for falling asleep during the history of World War II.
Because we're really talking about the collective memory and how information gets pulled from the archives and the collective memory. And certainly crowdsourcing, when people are digitizing information for free and making it at least more widely available, will increase the collective memory.
I'm a professor here, and I'm very interested in language. We know Gutenberg took care of time for world communication. The web takes care of space, and so does social networking and what you're doing. Talk to me about what you would do about language and open communication where people don't have access to English all over and where they still have the need to communicate, particularly in crisis situations or in human rights situations. Is that something that you consider part of your mission to address, or do you know who to go to help you address that?
Well, from my perspective, this is the motivating force behind Google Translate work. So there have been human translators forever. They're great, they're high quality, but they're very slow and very expensive. Machine translation has been done for years. It's mostly been terrible. It's gotten a lot better in the past few years because of the impact of large data. So we now translate, I forget the exact number because it seems to change every week, something like 100 different languages, including Klingon, should you need it. But the fact that we can actually bring up another language relatively quickly, like Haitian Creole, is a real testament to the fact that we have these mechanisms where we can actually start to build bridges between different bodies of information. So from an information access perspective, this is a huge advantage, in particular because I can search for information in Japanese, in the Japanese corpus of the web, that was inaccessible to me even 4 years ago. Okay? It's not perfect translation. Don't translate the tale of Genji this way, but it will get you access to stuff for especially technical information. It's just fantastic. So I think, yeah, we are in an increasingly competent era.
And this is when I think it really gets interesting, because anybody who's into translation knows that it's not this one-to-one transfer of meaning that the person who's doing the translating gets to spin it, or even if they don't mean to. And with crowdsourcing, it can be, you can call that person up. I was in a meeting once when the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène was speaking and was being translated, and someone in the back of the room said, "That is not what he said." And so the rest of us waited for about 10 minutes while they argued over about what he said. And then Ousmane Sembène turned around in English and said what he said. And crowdsourcing can do a similar thing where someone can say, well, wait a minute, that's not exactly what that means. And maybe you said that from your perspective as an American, and from my perspective as someone else, this means something else. And that conversation can happen very quickly and not just in elite spaces, if it happens. Now, that is an if it happens.
No, yeah, sure. Most of which have fewer than 500,000 speakers.
May I add one thing? I think this, for me, it's a central part of what I think needs to go forward, particularly in the crisis and human and disaster setting. And I would like to propose that English does not need to be at the central core, because crowdsourcing is, by some methodology, communication is a pathway for exchange of information. And there's no reason why English has to be at the central core of it for different types of communities. So taking those ideas and those methodologies and those communication channels can happen, like in Sensei, which is actually a project that I did not have time to talk about. It was actually the crowdsourcing of mapping information by OpenStreetMap by the Japanese citizens. It's sending of information through multiple channels in Japanese. We may not hear as much about it, actually, but it's still happening. And so we just need to enable that to happen, where those other languages are their own central core, and we come in and it's translated to us. But the central decision-making and its source and outcomes definitely should be in another language if it's appropriate.
There was.
Yes, okay, right here.
This one's for Jennifer. I liked your last diagram a lot, and I wondered if you thought about when you have that diagram up, you showed 3 equal-sized circles, but scaling them and then asking which are expandable, and that will affect your overlap.
Yeah, I actually have to tell you about a practical thing that I was doing when I was making those diagrams, and it was really sort of a thought process that came out of another person's idea and then actually communicated via Patrick Meyer's iRevolution blog. He's one of the most prolific academics and promoters of crisis mapping. But I was trying to actually make a reality check of moving those Venn diagrams around because I actually don't think they're equal at this point. And I think that there's a lot of interesting ways to break that visualization apart or innovate around it that I'd love to see yourself and other people hack away at, please.
Okay. Next question.
Oh, okay. The person with the microphone is deciding who goes next.
Hi, thanks. Very interesting panel. I want to crowdsource you and ask you if you could each name your #1 cautionary note about crowdsourcing. And I'm curious to see if you all come up with different answers or similar answers.
All right, great.
I've seen some very effective crowdsourcing tools used, but a problem with them is that they don't vet the issue being propagated. I'm thinking of petition sites and so on, so that people can have actually successfully run scams, and as a result, telling a good story but running scams to get something done, and then they get some results and then report back not entirely honestly. I've seen that happen, and that's going to erupt into some kind of scandal a la 3 cups of tea. I don't have any good ideas about solving it, except that wide open crowdsourcing sites like that are probably going to have to start vetting what they hear, because the people who thought they were helping others out actually wound up doing a lot of damage.
I'm actually going to cheat and give you 2, because I think one might be very specific to my realm, which I think safety, and the issue of people's understanding and expectation of how a piece of information translates into a whole chain of action, that how it might get deployed, everything from right now to in that court case in 10 years' time. I don't think we're necessarily doing a good job of helping people pass through the risks overall. The second is, I think, that supply-demand question, which is the fact that we can compile lots of information together doesn't mean that someone will look at it or act on it, especially if we haven't thought through information design, particularly in relation to a particular, both the audience or the people who will use it, as Jennifer was saying, very diverse, who might be the users of that information, the people who want to draw on it. And I don't think there's enough attention to how we translate a lot of information into relevance, actionable information for people who look at it. I think there's work on it, so I don't want to disparage. I think there's actually lots of good experimentation. I think it's an ongoing challenge.
I would say the term I would use is method fit for purpose. So who should be crowdsourcing? Say, for example, during disasters and crises. The whole group of people. When should we crowdsource? At what stage of the disaster cycle or complex emergency? What stage of conflict and war? And the last one I say is why. And sometimes the answer actually is not crowdsourcing. I think that's, again, why I say method fit for purpose.
I guess I would say, to sort of synthesize some of these points together, how do you take the output from a crowdsourced analysis and synthesize it with confidence, with understanding, partly because in many cases you don't know who your raters are and what kinds of background and what kind of perspectives they're bringing. And so one approach to dealing with that is to do a kind of polyphasic thing. That's what Ben and I were trying to do, is to do one level of work with a crowd source that, and then take that and reflect it back into a crowd, which is going to be different the second time around. So so basically, a huge issue for the crowdsourcing research community is how do we develop methods that produce reliable, robust, high confidence results? That we don't know how to do 100% yet.
And while you didn't ask me, David, what I would add is that we've been talking about crowdsourcing for good, and the potential for evil exists. Hate groups are using crowdsourcing. Southern Poverty Law Center is tracing them as best they can. And after the mic, after here, we've had a patient person.
Got it. Oh, okay. Here, you want to...
Oh,
okay.
Oh, I didn't mean to take it.
Okay, here we go. Thanks. I wondered if we could maybe think about crowdsourcing in biomedical research and answering questions. And certainly it has been used for this in many ways. There's a company called Innocentive, which works with biomedical researchers to ask questions. And the crowdsourcing, of course, there is posing specific questions, whether it's diabetes type 1 or asking for potential ways to address these issues from multidisciplinary investigators. And they may not even be biomedical investigators, but include those in social sciences as well. So I'm not sure we've really defined crowdsourcing. And are there different definitions, perhaps for different disciplines or different purposes? And do you see it with the biomedical research, it tends to go along with small amounts of money. There's a reward for this. So what is the element of perhaps having a more disciplined approach for certain questions or certain types? I guess that's a methodology. Should it ever come with small enticements that then can lead to even bigger types of more organized research?
Wow, there are at least 4 questions in there. Let me just take one of them. Different kinds of crowdsourcing? Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned one, which I actually don't think is a crowdsourcing style thing. It's just the survey. So there's a lot of traditional biomedical research, a lot of traditional research that relies on large N samples. That I don't think of particularly as crowdsourcing. I think of something more like Stack Overflow or Math Overflow, where people pose problems and then many people work to solve that problem as a classical crowdsourcing problem. Or taking a large problem and breaking it up into many, many different little pieces and sharding it into pieces that when reintegrated, so for example, the search for Jim Gray, who well-known Silicon Valley guy who was lost off when sailing the boat off Golden Gate in San Francisco. We took a bunch of the images taken off the Pacific Ocean right at that time and broke it up in little tiles. And we allocated, each one to like 3 people so they could look for evidence there. So that's taking a large problem, sharding it. Then there's the multiple people working to resolve a particular issue. And then there's just plain old surveys. So that's 3 kinds. We must have other kinds.
Right? For specific biomedical crowdsourcing, the Department of Veterans Affairs has had efforts where they talk to vendors, basically asking, hey, how can you use some of this new technology, cell phones which talk Bluetooth into the net, how can you use that to provide better service for wounded warriors? And that looks pretty good and promises to help us all out, because I'm looking forward in a few years to being all wired up, and when something goes wrong, it'll send a message to the net and get some help for me. That's maybe only a year or 2 off, if that.
I think the idea on crowdsourcing ideas in biomedical research or the biomedical space, I think is a great opportunity. But those are ideas in getting interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary people together into actually a real physical space where people can have what I've experienced, like, what do you mean by code? In my field, it means this. In your field, it means that. And then you kind of whack away what your new definition may be. I think there's great potential. I do think there are some challenges with regard to biomedical research and methodologies of what even me as a physician, like, I've been trained in, evidence-based medicine and randomized control trials and type 1, type 2 error, all that sort of good stuff that I actually believe in and I practice with. And I think as we go and we talk about funding and the transition from ideas to studies to medical evidence, that is where I see actually some of the greatest challenges of conceptualization of being able to support that transition. But if we can break through that as a field of biomedical science or biosciences, I think we will have great, amazing new methodologies that will complement the ones that people like me and other practicing clinicians and will still value, but there's a lot more that we could be using from the practitioners.
All right. Yes. Hello, and it's on. I'm working at the Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division, and wanted to cycle back to the question from the National Park Service about crowdsourcing the past. And by past, I mean anything from yesterday all the way back to Byzantium and cave paintings and so forth. So I can certainly validate what Mr. Russell said already. There are plenty of willing experts out there ready to contribute. The hazard for most repositories is connecting with those experts. And so one of the lessons we have in our learning column from Library of Congress is take the pictures to where the people are. The Flickr Commons would be an excellent example of an open space where there are more than 250,000 images now, and thousands and hundreds of thousands of tags and comments just pouring in, and often with very credible, validated information. Here's why I know what I know. So people have been great at citing their sources. But the more complicated challenges that I'd love to hear the futurists address, some of our barriers ongoing are problems about rights to images. So how freely can we make which pictures available? There's an awful lot now that is before World War II, for example. And there's certainly plenty of more recent past that we'd love to capture people's memories or factual information that they would be willing to gather for us. So rights and how we cope with that as an element of crowdsourcing. And then secondly, the pictures get copied and copied and copied into new spaces, of course. We want them distributed and better known to people. But as each community adapts the picture, and perhaps they are the best crowdsourcers and want to control the pictures in their own way, that's fine by me at least. But how might we link all these various iterations of the images so that there's a mass accumulation of the crowdsourcing information? Thanks.
Looking ahead, I tend to think about how we can solve it moving ahead, and I'm going to take the futurist one to argue for the solution moving forward, because I think you've got a huge issue there around rights, but I've almost no sense of how you resolve that. One of the things we've thought about a lot with designing tools like Informacam is like thinking about how the metadata and the way people structure the metadata moving forward might allow for different scenarios that enhance usages. So the metadata standard in Informacam is very structured towards evidentiary uses, so how do people think about it? But one of the other ideas we've played around with is intentionality-based usages. And what I mean by that is, and again, I'm speaking from a human rights spaces, a lot of the time people generate media and they're not necessarily concerned about the copyright, nor are they concerned about getting commercial value out of it, nor are they concerned about adaptation, but they're interested in, for example, will this be used for a particular purpose? So if you think a lot about the way in which people remix footage, I might well be interested in having someone use my clip from Syria to promote democracy in Syria, and I don't care how you remix and use that clip, and for however long you do that, as long as you use that usage. And so I think part of it is understanding moving forward how people think about the data they create and the options they have, which might relate to actually the primary concerns for people, which might not necessarily be commercial, non-commercial, copyright-free. I'm putting that out as a moving forward idea because I actually don't know how you'd resolve looking backwards. It feels like you're dealing with the machinery of copyright law as it is versus where we might want to move in terms of how people think about the way images circulate now and why people create images and put them in that flow.
And we really are talking about changing definitions of authorship and ownership of ideas and property, and as those old copyrights expire, that will be retroactively adapted to whatever the new laws look like whenever they come. Right.
Some of the copyright and licensing issues are addressed by the Creative Commons. A lot of them would have to be addressed, I guess, by Congress. That will be difficult in the current political environment. For everyone here, Something you can do now is start at least to scan in your old photos, because everyone here probably has a few really old ones hanging around that, well, you might regret otherwise losing. Do be careful, because otherwise your wife may scan a photo into Facebook that might have to be explained later, as in days ago. But it's worth doing, and it can be done increasingly cheaply. It wasn't all that embarrassing.
Well, you know, an issue for copyright is it's not just a United States issue. Particularly for Google, it's an international problem. So we have to sort of reconcile mutually irreconcilable copyright laws. And so, for example, the copyright law in Australia is not the same as the United States, it's not the same as France, and it gives me a headache constantly. I mean, copyright law seems to me to be sort of fundamentally ill at this point, particularly when you take this international perspective. But I think to the other point you were asking about, I think Craig's right. I think, you know, putting stuff out there on the web and allowing people to work on it is great. I don't know how to solve the aggregate accumulation of interpretations problem, other than at least attach it to the document so you don't lose it. It's terrible to get all that information and then drop it, because one of the things, as Craig alluded to, more technology will come. So for example, we can now do a lot of face reco. You get automatic tagging when you upload a lot of your images.
Face recognition.
For example, yeah. So imagine a world 10, 20 years out where you can upload a photo from the 1900s and the faces are automatically tagged. And it might even be able to say, this is a Matthew Brady photograph from before 1900, right? That kind of thing. So you can imagine a world where you at least accumulate that data. Even if you can't make sense of it now, somebody may. And in particular, thinking about it from an archival perspective, you never want to drop data on the floor, because there's all kinds of additional modalities and things that you might not think are important. I think of the archivists who go and smell certain letters because they are scented with perfumes or with particular disinfectants. That's an interesting form of information. In the same way, XIF data, which is now attached to most images, is something that will continue to be more useful. And as Sam was suggesting, additional tagging and additional fingerprinting and watermarking is going to be interesting in the future, both because we have to remember how to decode it and for the possibility of forgery. So technology, as we've talked about in all these examples, cuts both ways. I can fingerprint it and make it an evidentiary piece of archival imagery, but somebody might be able to synth that and fake it and spoof it in the future. So it's one of these things that's a constantly moving target. I don't know if there's an answer.
Is there anybody in the audience who wants to talk about the challenges of curating? Because that's really what we're talking about at this moment. No? Okay. Wait, did you want to speak to curating or something else? Okay.
Okay, there's a lot of arms. Okay.
Pick one.
Hi, yes. My question was about anonymity and accountability in crowdsourcing. So a lot of times, for example, with chatbots, you'll have people try to contribute to make a working, chatbot that'll pass the Turing test, for example, but then an environment like 4chan will take over and ruin its usability. Or as Gregory was speaking about, Mr. Gregory, sorry, you might want to use crowdsourcing where you want it to be anonymous so that people that contribute a video footage of a crime, for example, can't be identified later and taken in. So how do you, or what do you think about the balance between anonymity and, being accountable for what you put out there in terms of crowdsourcing?
I can answer that more in a general sense, because I don't think it's just specific to crowdsourcing. I think there's a long-standing tradition that for free expression, you need to have the possibility of anonymity. Now, that doesn't mean that you should necessarily encourage people to do that. I think in a society in which you can identify each other often builds stronger relationships. I think a persistent, trusted identity is often as good as a real identity. But there is a long tradition of looking at situations where it would be impossible for someone to expose injustice without the ability to be anonymous. And I believe that you've got to let the choices about that decision rest close to people who know the risks of participating in the system. So I don't want the choices about anonymity to be determined anywhere but the person who is close to it. Of course, there might be a corresponding expectation that I might trust you less, that I might value your information less, but I want the option for anonymity to be close to you, and I want that from a human rights perspective, because I think freedom of expression comes from having that option and not being told that you always have to link your name to a piece of information, particularly if it's something unpopular. But yeah.
But it gets harder as more and more of the world is using mobile technology, because that makes it so much more easily traceable back to a moment and a location. As well as
and with facial recognition as well. If you think of your faces, you're
I mean, I think anonymity, particularly subbing off of your comment about mobile technology and SMS messages, I'd like to lay it out there, especially during crises. How are you going to communicate to people about their opt-in, opt-out position when there is so much going on and maybe there's so much of a belief that they can ask for services or express something that they need? And how do you work on anonymity, or how do you actually give that choice to all that community or those people who want to engage? And a lot of it, through some of the work I've done in case studies and looking at some of the Ushahidi experiences of the communities that use the Ushahidi platform, a lot of this, even in non-disaster settings, is about campaign and messaging. It's about taking the time, if you have it, or using preparatory phases to really train and inform people about that opt-in, opt-out side. But also when the information comes in, and Rob Monroe has done a lot of really great work, and he's a computational linguist from Stanford, is anonymizing data, stripping cell phone numbers off the data sets, striking out names, things like that, that can be used as that information moves forward, as it gets processed. Not only does it anonymize and potentially safe keep the sender, but it potentially actually safeguards the processing groups of people, and sometimes a volunteer, digital humanitarians, in the whole process of microtasking and filtering. Because in complex conflict spaces, all of those people involved in that entire chain need to be informed of their risk.
Question over here.
Yes.
Hi. I'm really interested in, since crowdsourcing and citizen science is going to become more and more part of people's reality, if you have any thoughts or ideas on how in education we should be preparing people to be better crowd members, particularly since so much of this data has to do with geography-related information, and geography isn't taught in American public schools. If you have any ideas on if that's even a problem or what we should do about it.
Well, I know of a particular project that falls in the citizen science realm. It's beautifully crowdsourced. It's the Ladybug Project at Cornell, Department of Entomology. And they are asking people, you could Google it, look it up. They ask people to actually take photographs using their cell phone or whatever camera they've got of a ladybug that they find and record GPS like where they found it. This is a fantastic project because it turns out that ladybird beetles, ladybugs, are moving in their in their demographics, if you will, where they are and where they're moving. The species boundaries are changing for various reasons. They want to track that. Okay, so I think it's crucial that our students learn what it's like to participate in this, because in the realm, in the age of citizen journalism, it's important to be able to be an accurate reporter of this. I would love to see this as a kind of literacy, to build on your idea, right? A kind of literacy of participation, both for things like citizen journalism, for investigation, and for things that you can learn in school, like, you know, where do ladybugs live, right? I think that's a crucial thing that students should be learning right from the very beginning.
Okay, well, first, let's thank our futurists for giving us their thoughts. And Ira and Allison are back.
We have a few mementos for our visiting futurists. We want to thank you, and this is for Craig, Jennifer, and Sam. And here first.
Thank you. Wow.
Since Dan has too many of the crystals, we're actually now giving him FIA chocolate. So we now have a new memento. Open it up, Ira.
Cardiac.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
So FIA chocolate, and for you, Sherry, as well.
Oh, thank you.
And we have T-shirts for all our team members.
Yes, T-shirts for all of our team members.
So thank you very much. This was marvelous. Thank you all for coming, and you can watch our website on May 6th.
May 6th,
we'll
yes.
Our next program on big data, and Governor O'Malley will be co-sponsoring that one. So thank you. And
thank you.
Thank you.